I wanted to chat briefly with you both before we start drafting about the movie Brats.
Yes.
Brats is a new documentary available on Hulu. It's directed by Andrew McCarthy. Andrew McCarthy, very popular actor in the 1980s, a member of the Brat Pack. This documentary is, I guess, an exploration of the after effects of being written about in a magazine. This is one of the strangest things I've seen in a long time.
It's a portrait of a man on fire. Yeah.
So Andrew McCarthy, what he does is he goes back and goes and has conversations with his contemporaries, his friends, people he's lost touch with, people he worked with back in the 80s when this young cohort of actors, and some of our young listeners may not be as familiar with this moment. Maybe they know The Breakfast Club or they know Pretty in Pink, but they don't know that there was this group of people who were cast frequently together. Among them were Emilio Estevez, Ali Sheedy, Molly Ringwald, McCarthy, Judd Nelson, Demi Moore. Some of them went on to an extended period of success in their careers. Some of them kind of faded into obscurity.
Mm-hmm.
Andrew McCarthy faded into obscurity, candidly. I always kind of liked him as a screen presence.
He was great in those films.
In those movies. But he's clearly got a lot of issues.
Yeah.
Because he's made this entire film in which he sits down with people who, almost all of whom, seem pretty balanced and happy and not...
almost all of whom are more successful
Yeah.
than him going on in that.
But-
I mean, the first third of the movie is him doing solo therapy sessions to the camera in his car and then leaving voicemails for people who are more famous than him while feeding pigeons. Like, that's not an exaggeration. That's a very
perfect.
honest recap of the first third of the movie.
Yeah.
You're also leaving out the idea that he is using multiple film stocks.
I mean, the
And-
angle, I can't.
Like when he interviews Ali Sheedy, she's like, why is there an iPhone like on the floor? And he's like, that's another angle we're using. And she's like, cool.
Yeah. He's definitely getting his Truffaut on, which is a really, really confusing approach to this movie. You know, there are a couple of different schools of thought about the right way to tell a story like this. Obviously, McCarthy has thrown himself into this movie because it is in part about his life. And there were a couple of things that I learned that were interesting, and it was interesting to observe the very tense agreement between McCarthy and some of his interviewees, particularly Emilio Estevez.
Yeah.
Emilio Estevez and Andrew McCarthy clearly have not spent any time together in the last 35, maybe more years. They were going to embark on a project which comes up briefly right before this article hit. And the story that was written by David Blum in New York Magazine in 1985 was built around Emilio Estevez. Blum spent a lot of time with Estevez. And then after the story hit, he clearly panicked and rejiggered his entire career so that he no longer made any movies with anybody in the Brat Pack because he did not want to be associated. Estevez and McCarthy have this fascinating, we're in our 50s now. Is this okay? It isn't, but we'll just say that it is kind of détente.
Right.
Everybody else seems to be a lot less tense, but a little bit bemused.
Well, Rob Lowe and Demi
Rob
Moore
Lowe
are
are just
we are very successful and well-adjusted people.
We look amazing.
Yeah.
You know, we've had the good work.
Yes. Rob
and
Lowe
we're
is clearly
sitting in incredible
Everybody else just
vistas.
refuses to talk to him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he tries to bring in some voices who are not technically in the Brat Pack. You know, John Cryer, Leah
Right.
Thompson, very
Malcolm
familiar
Gladwell.
actors.
I can't. Oh, that
Malcolm
was one of them
Gladwell.
when I texted you.
Very curious. You know, an author of a book, a film critic, some
and
supporting
also the
voices.
person who just says yeah, man, that's how pop culture works.
Yes.
Straight up to him.
Yes. The most bracing part of this is the final confrontation, the final boss, the big bad, which is that at the end of the film, Andrew McCarthy manages to track down the long-working journalist who wrote this piece when he was 29 years old,
Yeah.
and who I guess tricked Emilio Estevez into thinking he was going to be his friend, and then wrote a somewhat scathing feature profile of this group
But
of
not
young actors.
unremarkable for that period of time in
Right.
celebrity profile
Totally
journalism. Whereas
Um,
sometimes it would be fawning, but very often, especially in the sort of urbane New York media, they would cut your heart out.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that was just kind of what happened if you rolled the dice with them.
You went out with a journalist a bunch of times in a
Yes.
social setting. Yeah.
All the
And-
way up through Maya truffle fries,
Right, exactly. And they made you feel at ease and that you could do anything in
good
their
one.
presence. And then all of a sudden, when the piece comes out, you realize, oh, this is not my friend,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is something that McCarthy literally says. I thought the conversation with David Blum was one of the strangest things I've ever seen. One, David Blum was just wildly ungenerous and definitely thought he was the star of the film. And I don't disrespect anything he did in writing the piece, but I was like, your performance is also quite strange here. But Andrew McCarthy basically getting worked in real time
Yeah.
by a 60-year-old journalist in the that upset the entire premise of the movie. He let the end of the movie he let the journalist like kill him again.
Yeah.
And then that was the end of the film. I thought was one of the weirdest creative
Here's
choices.
the thing.
Like you could have just cut that out of the movie.
Andrew McCarthy's not in the piece.
Like
I know.
He is mentioned as part of the Brat Pack. And like, I think he obviously feels like he took shrapnel from this piece. It was not about him. It was about Emilio Estevez, Rob Lowe, and Judd Nelson.
Yes.
Who are out one night. David Blum goes out with them. They're obviously like cutting lines at clubs and getting like recognized at bars and basically doing movie star shit, especially 1985 movie star shit. And Andrew McCarthy is like a tertiary part along with Tim Hutton and all these other people who are also mentioned in it. Various people have had various careers since then. The premise of this film is that this article, and specifically the term Brat Pack, fundamentally changed the course of Andrew McCarthy's life. Not him choosing to live in New York instead of Los Angeles, not him possibly growing out of the erudite, bookish young roles that he was known for. It was that this guy said he was in the Brat Pack, and then the weird thing is like he doesn't say, okay, how did it change your life? So what happened? Could you not get cast in roles? Did you start to become completely cynical about Hollywood so you didn't want to do movies anymore? Did you just want to be a theater actor in New York? Andrew McCarthy was a guy who like 6 weeks ago, I was like, you know what? Cool career. You know, like weird that he never really popped off, but was a travel writer, seems to really like be like a consummate New Yorker, seems to have his shit together largely. And it's really not for me to say whether he does or doesn't, but he directed this movie. So he was in charge of the portrait of himself. And it's quite strange. It's quite a strange,
very questionable
choice.
outcome. Yeah, I don't think it's going to radically change his legacy as a performer, but I felt very awkward watching the entire movie.
I mean, the entire project is somewhat misguided and is also just, once again, we are crying out for basic media literacy in this country. And it almost gets to like the part of the movie that was most interesting to me was when he was tracing how the term Brat Pack, which comes from this one New York Magazine piece in 1985 written by David Blum and the cover that goes with it, which frankly I just think is great magazine making. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I'm proud to have worked in New York Magazine. I mean,
David Blum wrote a follow-up article for Vulture where he's like, I'm glad I did it and I would do it again. Yeah. Like that was a good line.
And to me, the most poignant line of David Blum's scene with Andrew McCarthy is when he was like, well, it affected me too. I thought Tina Brown was going to come calling me and it never happened. And I was like, oh, here's another, the 80s magazines, we were all swinging big. So it started there, but then it very quickly became like a catch-all term that was used throughout media and basically became like a packaging for all the tabloids, all the talk shows. And I'm sure had an effect on how the industry perceived these people and how they were cast and how they were selling these movies and these stars back to the audiences, the teen audiences. Then it like totally drops that ball and is like, okay, so now I'm just going to really, really obsess over this one journalist and this one piece of writing that I could never get past.
I think the block for him is that he clearly was actually never in the crew. Like he was not really. He definitely had a night out with Rob Lowe, which they recount.
Minnelli?
Yeah, which sounds really fun.
I wish there was more stories like
after Spago.
But he was like, "Why am I paying for the sins when I don't get to reap the benefits of this? I'm a different kind of dude. I'm an East Coast guy. I'm not a movie star type. I'm an actor, even though I'm in Mannequin and Weekend at Bernie's. I'm an actor. And why wasn't I afforded the kind of respect that, say, like Demi Moore was able to build up over the course of her career?
Right.
But some people get it and some people don't.
Yeah.
And like ultimately the answer is like, it's the breaks of life. I'm sure it's very painful for him. The decision to go out and do this is utterly strange.
Right. And to not understand, maybe even at the end, but certainly when you're putting this all together and putting yourself in front of the camera with all these other people who have figured it out, that the problem's you, that's tough.
Do you think he got a lot of time with Demi Moore and Rob Lowe?
It seemed like an afternoon, couple of hours maybe. Yeah. I mean, they cut pretty hard around all the. I would say that the film is edited in this unusual way where you can see that he just doesn't have chemistry with these people. So we don't get these long discursive stories. What you really would want from a movie like this is great anecdotes, and you kind of get a glimmer of that like when Liza Minnelli shows up in the story.
So this is when we did St. Elmo's, and then after that you did this.
The Liza Minnelli Spago Night Out story contradicts the thesis of the movie, which is that Andrew McCarthy was never involved in the Brat Pack and so feels sad. And then as soon as Rob Lowe gets on camera, he's like, hey, remember Liza's? And then we went to Sammy's house. And they're saying Sammy, not the full name.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
So it's like, okay.
Strange.
Yeah. Really strange.
I think it's just a fascinating artifact of contemporary media.
But on the other side, I'm like, this is absolutely amazing that this was all filmed, recorded, and is available for us to watch. Like, I don't think that's what Andrew McCarthy wanted, but I'm like, I have an insight into something.
I don't know what it is that he wanted. I mean, the thing is that a lot of those movies, some of them haven't aged well or whatever, but a lot of them are pretty great. A lot of them are really fun to return to. Yeah. And in a way, this kind of soured me on some of those movies. It's not just the idea that they were like a ginned up creation of a journalist or that they weren't actually all buddies. I never cared about that when watching the movies. The characters were so good in so many of those movies that that's what you fixed yourself to.
I think that the big missing piece here was that a lot of the people he talked to either seemed to have had either left Hollywood or had decent careers afterwards. So like Demi Moore and Rob Lowe have had ups and downs in their careers, but have had career-defining roles way after the Brat Pack. If you had talked to Judd Nelson and Molly Ringwald, who I think are still frozen in amber in that time to a large extent, and Molly Ringwald herself has written beautifully about those movies and The New Yorker and stuff, like, I think that would have been fascinating to see him kind of have two people who were like, yeah, my life was not the same after this, and I never really, in terms of how I was perceived publicly, changed. Like Molly Ringwald has done lots of good work since then. Judd Nelson hasn't really been able to keep it together for a sustained amount of time. But yeah, and then they end with this. It ends with a kind of like, did you get Judd Nelson on the phone and he talked to you, or is this just a Breakfast Club?
This bizarre ending.
Yeah.
Also, there's a real lack of self-awareness of the role that Andrew McCarthy played in those movies and in the Brat Pack and in the so-called Brat Pack of, he was like the 80s yuppie and the embodied sort of like the Reagan era moment that a lot of people and culture wanted to move past. And so, like maybe he would have been in a Whit Stillman film, but also, they found other people as well. And so like but it doesn't have the examination of like, oh, my time passed me by. It's all based somewhere else.
What allowed me to get in is why the door closed on me in a way. Yeah. No, I think that's very true. The exclusion, the non-participation of Judd Nelson and Molly Ringwald is glaring. My suspicion was that maybe Molly Ringwald working on a documentary of her own, just because her life and like kind of what she represents generationally is so big. Just a gut thing.
I mean, she dated Ad Rock. She was so much more than Brat Pack.
Totally.
She's so cool.
But she was
but she
probably is she the actress of the 1980s? The most representative actress?
The Truman Capote show, right?
She was. She's in
and
she was one of the Swans. Yeah. And
Which
she's still
one?
working. I don't remember. I listened to an interview with her as well. But she's still working pretty regularly in television. But she's a bigger deal. The Judd Nelson thing is just one of those things where it's like, you shouldn't have made this movie. Like, if you can't get Judd Nelson to sit down for 10 minutes, like, then why did you even make the film?